Hello and welcome to the show that has no name. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And if you don't like this being called the show that has no name, we can just call it episode 3 of Studies in Archaic Buddhism. And this is going to be somewhat of a different kind of sutta than I commented upon in the first two installments. First, because it's not in the Atthaka Vagga, it's not in the Sutta Nipata at all. And secondly, because it's more of what you are likely to find if you're looking for archaic Buddhism embedded in the Pali texts. And by archaic, I mean proto-Theravada, not fully orthodox yet. It hasn't been, it's before the system of Theravada was completed, and so some of it is unorthodox. Or if not unorthodox, then at least a significant deviation from what you're going to find in the texts. I don't think that anything technically in this sutta would be considered just baldly unorthodox or heresy, pernicious wrong view, like some of the stuff in the Sutta Nipata that we've already gone over a little bit in the previous two installments. But as I say, this is more common of a kind of archaic Buddhism that you're going to find because it's a fragment embedded in a later sutta. So it's unlikely, or at least it's not very common, that you're going to find an entire sutta that is very, very old outside of like the Sutta Nipata. Excuse me. I have a drink of sweet tea. I'm in the South. So this is apparently a very old fragment surrounded by much later material. And it's just a strange sutta. You could say, a Westerner could say that most suttas in the Pali texts are strange, but this one is stranger than most. And one reason for that is that you got this really old fragment, and then it begins and ends with wildly mythological material, and including what could be considered the Buddhist Song of Songs, because one of the characters in this discourse, who is a Gandhava or Gandharva named Panchasika or Five Crest, sings this erotic or at least risque love song to the Buddha that you just wonder how it got into the text at all. Maybe I should mention, I certainly should mention, that the sutta in question is the Sakkapañha Sutta, which is Digha Nikaya number 21. It's one sutta before the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, which is the Bible for Vipassana meditators. This one is not as well known, but it's very noteworthy in certain respects. In fact, according to the sutta itself, it was this discourse given by the Buddha that caused Sakka, king of gods, to become an Arya, or more specifically, a Sotapanna. So this one is, this discourse caused Sakka, king of gods, to get a glimpse of like liberating insight. And so, for those of you who don't know who Sakka, king of gods is, it's to a Western capable of critical thought, a bit of religious propaganda. And the Theravada Buddhists were not above religious propaganda. And there are a lot of Buddhists, maybe even most Buddhists, who would consider this entire sutta to just be straight factual history. There are even some Western monks who are so faith-oriented that they just cannot doubt that this is just straight factual history. But to most Westerners, even most Buddhist Westerners, it's pretty obviously not entirely factual history. In fact, there might be very little actual factual history involved. The old philosophical section is still quite valid. It's worth considering, but most of the rest of it, you can just see it as essentially religious propaganda. And for those of you who don't know who Sakka, king of gods, is, from the Buddhist point of view, he's the overlord of Tawatimsa heaven, which is two levels above the human level in the 33 realms of existence. So you got the human level, and one level above that is the level of the four kings, which are like terrestrial, small g gods. And then above that, which is supposedly situated at the very top of Mount Meru, the tallest mountain in the world, is Tawatimsa heaven. And that was um, probably the origin of that is that was the heaven realm of the Vedic Brahmins. Like back in like early Vedic Brahmanism, their gods, their pantheon of gods lived in this heaven realm, and that became known as the realm of the 33 gods, or Tawatimsa heaven. And Sakka is their supreme king, and Sakka is just a Buddhistized version of Indra, who was the patron deity of the early Indo-Aryans. In fact, I think Sakka, or rather Indra, was venerated by Indo-Aryans that never even invaded India. There was one branch of Indo-Aryans that migrated west instead of migrating into India. And I'm sure I'm going to be causing some indignation in Hindus that think that the Aryan race arose in India and so forth. But they migrated as far west as northern Syria and became known as the Mitanni, or rather the ruling class were Indo-Aryans. They were ruling over a group of people that were not Indo-Aryans at all, but they worshipped Indra also, or venerated him, made sacrifices to him and so forth. And so what the Buddhists apparently did was they took the patron deity of northern India and converted him into a good Buddhist, which, I mean, it just makes sense that, that a Western person, a modern Westerner, would consider it to be kind of religious propaganda. So one other difference of this sutta from the ones I've discussed before is I didn't translate this into English. This is just from Maurice Walsh's well-known translation of the Digha Nikaya. I didn't want to go to the trouble of translating the whole thing. I might discuss a few of the Pali terms. Like, I don't agree on Walsh's translations of every term, but that's fine. So I guess I might as well just read the sutta. It's a long one. It's from the Digha Nikaya, which is the collection of long discourses. So I hope it doesn't get too tedious. Just about any translation is going to just gloss over or skip over the repetitions, and this one does likewise. For example, you've got that Song of Solomon, that risque love song. It gets sung twice, but it's only included once in the sutta, and I'll just go with that. There's no point in repeating it twice. So, without any further ado, I will begin the Sakkapañha Sutta, and it's divided into two sections. The entire first section, is this mythological stuff, and then I'll just let you know when we move into the second section. Thus have I heard, once the Lord was staying in Magadha, to the east of Rajagaha, by a Brahmin village called Ambasanda, to the north of the village on Mount Vaidya in the Indasala cave. And at that time Sakka, Lord of the gods, felt a strong desire to see the Lord. And Sakka thought, where is the blessed Lord, the fully enlightened Buddha, now staying? Then, perceiving where the Lord was, Sakka said to the 33 gods, Gentlemen, the blessed Lord is staying in Magadha in the Indasila cave. How would it be if we were to go and visit the Lord? Very good, Lord, and may good fortune go with you, replied the 33 gods. Then Sakka said to Panchasika of the Gandhabas, the blessed Lord is staying in Magadha in the Indasila cave. I propose to go visit him. Very good, Lord, said Panchasika, and taking his yellow Belawa wood lute, He followed in attendance on Sakka, and just as swiftly as a strong man might stretch forth his flexed arm or flex it again, Sakka, surrounded by the 33 gods and attended by Panchasika, vanished from the heaven of the 33 and appeared in Magadha on Mount Vaidya. Then a tremendous light shone over Mount Vaidya, illuminating the village of Ambasanda. So great was the power of the gods, so that in the surrounding villages they were saying, "Look, Mount Vaidya is on fire today. It's burning. It's in flames. What is the matter that Mount Vaidya and Ambasanda are lit up like this?" And they were so terrified that their hair stood on end. Then Sakka said, "Panchasika, it is hard for the likes of us to get near the Tathagatas when they are enjoying the bliss of meditation, and therefore withdrawn. But if you, Panchasika, were first to attract the ear of the Blessed Lord, then we might afterwards be able to approach and see the Blessed Lord, the fully enlightened Buddha." "Very good, Lord," said Panchasika, and taking his yellow Belawa wood lute, he approached the Indasila cave, thinking, "As far as this is neither too far nor too near to the Lord, and he will hear my voice," he stood to one side. Then to the strains of his lute he sang these verses, extolling the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Arahants, and love. "Lady, your father Timbaru greet. O sunshine fair, I give him honor due. By whom was sired a maid as fair as you, who are the cause of all my heart's delight. Delightful as the breeze to one who sweats, or as a cooling draught to one who thirsts. Your radiant beauty is to me as dear as the Dhamma is to the Arahants. Just as medicine to him who's ill, or nourishment to one who's starving still, bring me, gracious lady, sweet release with water cool from my consuming flames. The elephant, oppressed by summer heat, seeks out a lotus pool upon which float petals and pollen of that flower, so into your bosom sweet I'll plunge. As an elephant urged by the goad pays no heed to pricks of lance and spear, so I, unheeding, know not what I do, intoxicated by your beauteous form. By you my heart is tightly bound in bonds, all my thoughts are quite transformed, and I can no longer find my former course. I'm like a fish that's caught on baited hook. Come, embrace me, maiden, fair of thighs. Seize and hold me with your lovely eyes. Take me in your arms, it's all I ask. My desire was slight at first, O maid, of waving tresses, but it grew apace, and grow the gifts that Arahants receive, as grow the gifts that Arahants receive. Whatever merit I may have gained by gifts to those noble ones, may my reward when it ripens be your love most fair. As the Sakyan sun in jhana wrapt, intent and mindful seeks the deathless goal, thus intent I seek your love, my son. Just as that sage would be rejoiced if he were to gain supreme enlightenment, so I'd rejoice to be made one with you. If Sakka, lord of 33 gods, were perchance to grant a boon to me, it's you I'd crave, my love for you's so strong. Your father, maid, so wise, I venerate like a sal tree fairly blossoming, for his offspring's sake, so sweet and fair." When he heard this, the Lord said, "Panchasika, the sound of your strings blends so well with your song, and your song with the strings, that neither prevails excessively over the other. When did you compose these verses on the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Arahants, and love?" "Lord, it was when the Blessed Lord was staying on the bank of the river Neranjara under the goatherd's banyan tree prior to his enlightenment. At that time I fell in love with the lady Bada, bright as the sun, the daughter of King Timbaru of the Gandhabas, but the lady was in love with somebody else. It was Sikadi, the son of Matali the charioteer, whom she favored. And when I found that I could not win the lady by any manner of means, I took my yellow Belawa wood lute and went to the home of King Timbaru of the Gandhabas, and there I sang these verses, which are repeated, and I won't repeat them here. As Lord, having heard the verses, the lady Bada Surya Vachasa said to me, "Sir, I have not personally seen that Blessed Lord, though I heard of him when I went to the Sudama hall of the 33 gods to dance. And since, sir, you praise that Blessed Lord so highly, let us meet today." And so, Lord, I met the lady, not then, but later. Then Sakka thought, Panchasika and the Lord are in friendly conversation, so he called to Panchasika, My dear Panchasika, salute the blessed Lord from me, saying, Lord Sakka, King of Gods, together with his ministers and followers, pays homage at the feet of the blessed Lord. Very good, Lord, said Panchasika, and he did so. Panchasika, may Sakka, King of the Gods, his ministers and followers, be happy, for they all desire happiness, Devas, humans, Asuras, Nagas, Gandhabas, and whatever other beings, whatever other groups of beings there are. For that is the way the Tathagatas greet such mighty beings. After this greeting, Sakka entered the Indasila cave, saluted the Lord, and stood to one side, and the 33 gods with Panchasika did the same. Then in the Indasila cave the rough passages became smooth, the narrow parts became wide, and in the pitch-dark cavern it became bright, owing to the power of the Devas. Then the Lord said to Sakka, It is wonderful, it is marvelous that the venerable Kosya, with so many things to do, should come here. Lord, I have long wished to visit the blessed Lord, but I have always been so busy on behalf of the 33 that I was unable to come. Once the blessed Lord was staying at Sawati in the Salala hut, and I went to Sawati to see the Lord. At that time the blessed Lord was seated in some form of meditation, and King Wesawana's wife Bunjati was waiting on him, venerating him with palms together. I said to her, Lady, please salute the blessed Lord for me and say, Sakka, the King of the Gods, with his ministers and followers, pays homage at the Lord's feet. But she said, Sir, it is not the right time to see the blessed Lord, he is in retreat. Well then, lady, when the blessed Lord rises from his meditation, please tell him what I have said. Lord, did the lady salute you on my behalf, and does the Lord remember what she said? She did salute me, King of the Gods, and I remember what she said. I also remember that it was the sound of your reverence's chariot wheels that roused me from my meditation. Lord, those gods who arose in the heaven of the 33 before I did have told me and assured me that whenever a Tathagata, a fully enlightened Arahant Buddha, arises in the world, the ranks of Devas increase and those of the Asuras decline in numbers. In fact, I witnessed this myself. There was, Lord, right here in Kapilavatthu, a Sakyan girl named Gopika who had faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, and who observed the precepts scrupulously. She rejected the status of a woman and developed the thought of becoming a man. Then, after her death, at the breaking up of the body, she went to a happy destination, being reborn in a heaven state among the 33 gods as one of our sons, becoming known as Gopaka, the Deva's son. Also, there were 3 monks who, having observed the holy life under the blessed Lord, had been reborn in the inferior condition of Gandhabas. They lived indulging in the pleasures of the 5 senses as our attendants and servants. At this, Gopaka rebuked them, saying, What were you about, sirs, that you did not listen to the blessed Lord's teaching? I was a woman who had faith in the Buddha. I rejected the status of a woman and was reborn among the 33 gods and am known as Gopaka, the Deva's son. But you, after having observed the holy life under the blessed Lord, have been reborn in the inferior condition of Gandhabas. It is a sorry sight for us to see our fellows in the Dhamma reborn in the inferior condition of Gandhabas. And being thus rebuked, 2 of those Devas immediately developed mindfulness, and so attained to the realm of the retinue of Brahma. But one of them remained addicted to sensual pleasures. Gopaka spoke in verse. Disciple once of him who sees, the name I bore then Gopika, in Buddha Dhamma firmly trusting. I served the Sangha cheerfully, for loyal service paid to him. See me now, a Sakka son, mighty in the threefold heaven, resplendent, Gopaka my name. Then former monks I saw who'd reached no higher than Gandhabba's rank, who before had human birth and led the life the Buddha taught. We supplied their food and drink and waited on them in our homes. Had they no ears that they thus blessed, still could not grasp the Buddha's law? Each for himself must understand that Dhamma taught by him who sees and well proclaimed, I, serving you, heard the noble one's good words, and so I'm born a Sakka son, mighty in the threefold heaven, and resplendent, whereas you, though you served the Prince of Men and led the matchless life he taught, have reappeared in humble state and not attained your proper rank, A sorry sight it is to see one's Dhamma fellows sunk so low that Gandhava spirits you but come to wait upon the gods, while as for me, I am transformed. From household life and female I am now reborn a male, a god rejoicing in celestial bliss. When thus rebuked by Gopaka, disciple true of Gautama, in sore distress they all replied, Alas, let's go and strive amain and be no longer others' slaves. And of the three, two struggled hard and bore in mind the teacher's word. They purified their hearts of lust, perceiving peril in desires, and like the elephant that bursts all restraining bonds, they broke the fetters and the bonds of lust, those fetters of the evil one, so hard to overcome, and thus the very gods, the 33, with Indra and Pajapati, who sat enthroned in council hall, these two heroes, passions purged, outstripped, and left them far behind. On seeing which, Vasava, dismayed, chief amidst that throng of gods, cried, See how these of lesser rank outstrip the gods, the 33. Then hearing of his ruler's fears, Gopaka said to Vasava, Lord Indra, in the world of men, a Buddha called the Sakyan sage has gained the mastery of lust, and these his pupils who had failed in mindfulness when claimed by death have now regained it with my help. Though one of them is left behind and still among Gandhabas dwells, these two on highest wisdom set in deep absorption spurn the gods. Let no disciple ever doubt that truth may yet be realized by those who dwell in these abodes. To him who's crossed the flood and make an end of doubts, our homage due, the Buddha, victor, Lord, we give. Even here they gain the truth and so have passed beyond to greater eminence. Those two have gained a higher place than this in realms of Brahma's retinue, and we have come, O Lord, in hope that we may gain that truth, and, if the Lord will give us leave, to put our questions to the blessed Lord. Then the Lord thought, Sakka has lived a pure life for a long time. Whatever questions he may ask will be to the point and not frivolous, and he will be quick to understand my answers. So the blessed Lord replied to Sakka in this verse, Ask me, Sakka, all that you desire. On what you ask, I'll put your mind at rest. And that is the end of the first recitation, and now comes the philosophical part. Being thus invited, Sakka, ruler of the gods, put his first question to the Lord. By what fetters, sir, are beings bound? Gods, humans, asuras, nagas, gandhabas, and whatever other kinds there may be, whereby, although they wish to live without hate, harming, hostility, or malignity, and in peace, they yet live in hate, harming one another, hostile, and malign. This was Sakka's first question to the Lord, and the Lord replied, Ruler of the gods, it is the bonds of jealousy and avarice that bind beings, so that, though they wish to live without hate, they yet live in hate, harming one another, hostile and malign. This was the Lord's reply, and Sakka, delighted, exclaimed, So it is, Lord, so it is, well-farer. Through the Lord's answer I have overcome my doubt and got rid of uncertainty. Then Sakka, having expressed his appreciation, asked another question. But, sir, what gives rise to jealousy and avarice? What is their origin? How are they born? How do they arise? Owing to the presence of what do they arise? Owing to the absence of what do they not arise? Jealousy and avarice, ruler of the gods, take rise from like and dislike. This is their origin. This is how they are born, how they arise. When these are present, they arise. When these are absent, they do not arise. But, sir, what gives rise to like and dislike? Owing to the presence of what do they arise? Owing to the absence of what do they not arise? They arise, ruler of the gods, from desire. Owing to the presence of desire, they arise. Owing to the absence of desire, they do not arise. But, sir, what gives rise to desire? Desire, ruler of the gods, arises from thinking. When the mind thinks about something, desire arises. When the mind thinks about nothing, desire does not arise. But, sir, what gives rise to thinking? Thinking, ruler of the gods, arises from the tendency to proliferation. When this tendency is present, thinking arises. When it is absent, thinking does not arise. Well, sir, what practice has that monk undertaken who has reached the right way, which is needful in leading to the cessation of the tendency to proliferation? Ruler of the gods, I declare that there are two kinds of happiness. the kind to be pursued and the kind to be avoided. The same applies to unhappiness and equanimity. Why have I declared this in regard to happiness? This is how I understood happiness. When I observed that in the pursuit of such happiness, unwholesome factors increased and wholesome factors decreased, then that happiness was to be avoided. And when I observed that in the pursuit of such happiness, unwholesome factors decreased and wholesome ones increased, then that happiness was to be sought after. Now, of such happiness as is accompanied by thinking and pondering, and of that which is not so accompanied, the latter is the more excellent. The same applies to unhappiness and to equanimity. And this, ruler of the gods, is the practice that monk has undertaken who has reached the right way, leading to the cessation of the tendency to proliferation. And Sakka expressed his delight at the Lord's answer. Then Sakka, having expressed his appreciation, asked another question. Well, sir, what practice has that monk undertaken who has acquired the restraint required by the rules? Ruler of the gods, I declare that there are two kinds of bodily conduct, the kind to be pursued and the kind to be avoided. The same applies to conduct of speech and to the pursuit of goals. Why have I declared this in regard to bodily conduct? This is how I understood bodily conduct. When I observed that by the performance of certain actions, unwholesome factors increased and unwholesome factors decreased, and wholesome factors decreased, then that form of bodily action was to be avoided. And when I observed that by the performance of such actions, unwholesome factors decreased and wholesome ones increased, then such bodily action was to be followed. That is why I make this distinction. The same applies to conduct of speech and the pursuit of goals. And this, ruler of the gods, is the practice that monk has undertaken who has acquired the restraint required by the rules. And Sakka expressed his delight at the Lord's answer. Then Sakka asked another question. Well, sir, what practice has that monk undertaken who has acquired control of his sense faculties? Ruler of the gods, I declare that things perceived by the eye are of two kinds, the kind to be pursued and the kind to be avoided. The same applies to things perceived by the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. At this, Sakka said, Lord, I understand in full the true meaning of what the Blessed Lord has outlined in brief. Lord, whatever object perceived by the eye, if its pursuit leads to the increase of unwholesome factors and the decrease of wholesome ones, that is not to be sought after. If its pursuit leads to the decrease of unwholesome factors and the increase of wholesome ones, such an object is to be sought after. And the same applies to things perceived by the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. Thus I understand in full the true meaning of what the Blessed Lord has outlined in brief, and thus, through the Lord's answer, I have overcome my doubt and got rid of uncertainty. Then Sakka asked another question. Sir, do all ascetics and Brahmins teach the same doctrine, practice the same discipline, want the same thing, and pursue the same goal? No, ruler of the gods, they do not. But why, sir, do they not do so? The world, ruler of the gods, is made up of many and various elements. Such being the case, beings adhere to one or other of these various things, and whatever they adhere to, they become powerfully addicted to and declare, this alone is the truth, everything else is false. Therefore, they do not all teach the same doctrine, practice the same discipline, want the same thing, pursue the same goal. Sir, are all ascetics and Brahmins fully proficient, freed from bonds, perfect in the holy life? Have they perfectly reached the goal? No, ruler of the gods. Why is that, sir? Only those, ruler of the gods, who are liberated by the destruction of craving are fully proficient, freed from the bonds, perfect in the holy life, and have perfectly reached the goal. And Sakka rejoiced at the answer as before. Then Sakka said, Passion, sir, is a disease, a boil, a dart. It seduces a man, drawing him into this or that state of becoming, so that he is reborn in high states or low. Whereas other ascetics and Brahmins of differing viewpoints gave me no chance to ask these questions, the Lord has instructed me at length and thus removed the dart of doubt and uncertainty from me. Ruler of the gods, do you admit to having asked the same questions of other ascetics and Brahmins? Yes, Lord. Then, if you don't mind, please tell me what they said. I do not mind telling the Blessed Lord or one like him. Then tell me, ruler of the gods. Lord, I went to those I considered to be ascetics and Brahmins because of their solitary life in the woods, and I put these questions to them. But instead of giving me a proper answer, they asked me in return. "Who are you, venerable sir?" I replied that I was Sakka, ruler of the gods, and they asked me what had brought me there. Then I taught them the Dhamma as far as I had heard it and practiced it, but they were very pleased with even that much, and they said, "We have seen Sakka, the ruler of the gods, and he has answered the questions we put to him." And they became my pupils instead of my becoming theirs. But I, Lord, am not a disciple, but I, Lord, am a disciple of the blessed Lord, a stream winner, not subject to rebirth in states of woe, firmly established and destined for full enlightenment. Ruler of the gods, do you admit to having ever previously experienced rejoicing and happiness such as you experience now? Yes, Lord. And what was that about? In the past, Lord, war had broken out between the gods and the asuras, and the gods had defeated the asuras, and after the battle, as victor, I thought, whatever is now the food of the gods, and what is the food of the asuras, henceforth we shall enjoy both. But Lord, such happiness and satisfaction, which was due to blows and wounds, does not conduce to dispassion, detachment, cessation, peace, higher knowledge, enlightenment, nibbana. But that happiness and satisfaction that is obtained by hearing the Dhamma from the blessed Lord, which is not due to blows and wounds, does not conduce to dispassion, detachment, cessation, peace, higher knowledge, enlightenment, nibbana. And, ruler of the gods, what things do you call to mind when you admit to experience such satisfaction and happiness as this? Lord, at such a time 6 things come to mind at which I rejoice. I who merely as a god exist have gained the chance by karma of another earthly life. That, Lord, is the first thing that occurs to me. Leaving this non-human realm of gods behind, unerringly, I'll seek the womb I wish to find. That, Lord, is the second thing. My problem solved, I'll gladly live by Buddha's law, controlled and mindful, and with clear awareness filled. That, Lord, is the third thing. And should thereby enlightenment arise in me as one who knows, I'll dwell and there await my end. That, Lord, is the fourth thing. Then, when I leave the human world again, I'll be once more a god and one of highest rank. That, Lord, is the fifth thing. More glorious than devas are the peerless gods, among whom dwelling I shall make my final home. That, Lord, is the sixth thing that occurs to me, and these are the 6 things at which I rejoice. Long I wandered unfulfilled in doubt, in quest of thee, Tathagata. I thought, hermits who live secluded and austere must surely be enlightened. I'll seek them. What must I do to gain success, and what course but leads to failure? But thus asked, they could not tell me how to tread the path. Instead, when they found out that I am king of gods, they asked me why I'd come to them, and I it was who taught them what I knew of Dhamma, and at that rejoicing they cried, "It's Vasava the Lord we've seen." But now I've seen the Buddha, and my doubts are all dispelled, my fears are allayed, and now the enlightened one I pray, homage due to him who's drawn the dart of craving, to the Buddha, peerless Lord, mighty hero, kinsman of the sun. Just as Brahma's worshipped by the gods, so likewise today we worship you, enlightened one, and teacher unsurpassed, whom none can equal in the human world, or in the heavens, dwelling of the gods. Then Sakka, ruler of the gods, said to Panchasika of the Gandhabas, "My dear Panchasika, you have been of great help to me for gaining the ear of the blessed Lord, for it was through your gaining his ear that we were admitted to the presence of the blessed Lord, the Arhat, the supremely enlightened Buddha. I will be a father to you. You shall be king of the Gandhabas, and I will give you Bhada Surya Vachasa, whom you desired." And then Sakka, ruler of the gods, touched the earth with his hand and called out 3 times, "Homage to the Blessed One, the Arahant, the supremely enlightened Buddha. Homage to the Blessed One, the Arahant, the supremely enlightened Buddha. Homage to the Blessed One, the Arahant, the supremely enlightened Buddha." And while he had been speaking in this dialogue, the pure and spotless Dhamma eye arose within Sakka, ruler of the gods, and he knew, whatever things have an origin must come to cessation. And the same thing happened to 80,000 devas as well. Such were the questions which Sakka, ruler of the gods, was desirous to ask, and which the Lord answered for him. Therefore, this discourse is called Sakka's Questions. And that is the end of the discourse. And as you can see, it's kind of a strange one with a lot of mythology involved, despite the fact that really devout, faith-oriented Buddhists, including some Western ones, would consider it all to just be factual history. But I've never really swung that way. That's one reason why I never was a Christian. Having to believe stories that seem kind of far-fetched, it's just, I just can't bring myself to do it. It's just really not a viable option for me. But as an example of why I consider this to be an old sutta, I'll read G.C. Pandey's commentary on this sutta in his classic book, Studies in the Origins of Buddhism, which is published by Motilal Banarsidass. I'm sure you can find it on the internet. And one of the main purposes of this book, it's one of the most important books I've ever read with regard to helping me to understand what the Buddha actually taught. You know, being able to sift through the Pali texts and find what is more likely to actually be the authentic teachings of the Buddha. Because as this sutta demonstrates, not everything in the text is likely to be authentic, factual history. It's not just verbatim quotes of everything the Buddha said, or at least people capable of critical thought and some degree of skepticism would tend to agree with me on that. But anyway, let's see here. Digha Nikaya 21. And the first word is composite. So he's saying it's a composite sutta. It's old and new mixed together, or at least old and not so old mixed together in one sutta. Rhys Davids calls Digha Nikaya 21 an example of Tenden Schriften written with the object of persuading the Kosala clansmen that they did not need to be in the least afraid, for their own gods were on the side of the Reformation. And Tenden Schriften is a strange word. I looked it up on Google Translate. It's pretty obviously German. And it's just sort of like, Schriften is writing. Tenden would be sort of like following the trends or something like that. So it's sort of like, in a way, it's kind of like propaganda or just sort of reconciling people to new trends, something like that. Winternitz advances the analogy of the sectarian Puranas and considers the sutta late. Bapat comes to the same conclusion on grounds of the mythological character of the sutta and the secular character of the poem, and incorporates a fact which he interprets as a sign of decadence. It may well be added that the sutta calls itself a Vyakarana at the end. And a Vyakarana is a kind of question and answer sutta that is generally considered by scholars to be late additions to the Sutta and Pitaka. A lot of these Vyakaranas don't even involve the Buddha. It's like some senior disciple of the Buddha that's doing the Q&A. And that in itself is a indication that it's the odds are less that it's going to be like really old stuff. On the other hand, there are undoubted indications of its earliness. It has been quoted by name in the Anguttara Nikaya. Its title and the purpose and style of its second Banavara, or as the second portion for recitation that starts with the philosophical stuff. Its title and the purpose and style of its second Banavara are reminiscent of the puchas in the Parayana Vaga of the Sutta Nipata. And the Parayana Vaga is another very old sutta, or a very old group of suttas that comes after the Attaka Vaga and the Sutta Nipata. The first series of questions and answers is closely similar to Sutta Nipata Sutta 49 of the Attaka Vaga, which is the Kalahavivada Sutta that I'll get into a little bit later, and contains an unusual development of the theory of nidanas. Otherwise, also the answers to the queries do not suffer from hackneyed expressions and formulae. It appears that while the late features of the sutta are mainly confined to the mythological, the early features are mainly confined to the dialectical portions of the sutta. Now it is noticeable that the former, the mythological portions, are found almost wholly in the introductory first Banavara and the conclusion of the second, and it is these portions alone that use verse. May it not then be said that we have here the case of an early short prose dialogue concerned with dogmatic points and not far removed from the Atthaka and Parayana Wagas of the Sutta Nipata, encased within a later luxuriantly mythological prologue and epilogue? And I would tend to agree with that. It could be that some of the prose philosophical stuff also is not like really ancient, but there is some pretty good evidence that at least the first part of the philosophical part, where Sakka is saying, what causes this? And the Buddha says, that causes this. And then Sakka says, well, what causes that? And the Buddha says, this causes that. And then, you just go through this list of cause and effect. And that is very similar to the Kalahavivada Sutta of the Atthaka Wagga. And both of them, I'm pretty sure the commentary doesn't mention this at all. Maybe the commentators didn't even notice it. But both of them could be considered a kind of proto-paticca or dependent co-arising, or conditioned genesis, or there's a lot of different terms for of English equivalencies of paticca, which is the Buddhist theory of everything. That there is a sutta where the Buddha says that, whoever sees paticca sees the Dhamma. That he pretty much equates understanding Dhamma with understanding dependent co-arising. And also, there is a legend in the suttas saying that the Buddha almost just became a hermit and didn't try to teach Buddhism or Dhamma because he figured nobody would understand dependent co-arising, and he wasn't far from the truth. I mean, that legend itself is another case of religious propaganda, because it was Brahma who was like the personification of ultimate reality for the proto-Hindus of the Buddhist time. They had to come down to earth and beg the Buddha to start teaching Buddhism. So you've got Brahma in that legend, and then you've got Sakka in this sutta. Both of them are essentially groveling before this human. And you can say, well, the Buddha was fully enlightened, so even the gods are going to venerate him. But it seems more likely that, especially considering the weird changes that the Buddhists made in both of these deities, Brahma and Sakka, or Indra, that it's essentially a kind of religious propaganda. And there's lots of it in the text, and it's uncomfortable for me to read it. It can be kind of embarrassing because you want to venerate your own tradition, but even a venerable tradition is run by humans, and humans are fallible, and they're going to be throwing in all these kind of digs at other systems, and just kind of it's embarrassing sometimes. So I suppose at this point I should go back and just start sort of a partial commentary. I'm not going to comment in detail, just for the sake of keeping this limited to a reasonable amount of time. But we can kind of go through it a little bit. So I'll scroll upwards here, get back up to the beginning of the sutta, and try and comment on things that are noteworthy. So I'm still scrolling up here, still scrolling up, and still scrolling. Okay, yeah, it is a long sutta. So, Sakkapañha Sutta. And let's see. Since the Lord was staying in Magadha, Sakka, Lord of the gods, felt a strong desire to see the Lord. And so he gets all the other, essentially he empties out Tawatimsa heaven, at least with regard to the high status deities there. He probably left all the celestial nymphs and the servants and stuff behind. And he goes down to visit the Buddha, who is living in the Indasala cave. Probably no coincidence it's called Indasala, since Inda is the Pali word for Indra, in addition to Sakka. And Sakka is also called by a number of other names in this, at least two other names in the sutta, which we may get to if I notice them. So anyway, the next character here is Panchasika of the Gandhabas. And the Gandhabas are a kind of low-level deity. They're in I already mentioned that the one heaven realm above the human level, or the plane of existence just right above the human level, is the level of the four kings, who are the four kings who guard the four directions of the earth. Kind of like in that Rush song, the snow dog is the guardian of the north. So you've got guardian of the north, guardian of the south, guardian of the east, guardian of the west. And so the Gandhabas were a kind of celestial musician. They're kind of like elves or something, and they act as servants to the higher gods. They play music, and apparently the female Gandhaba that Panchasika had the hots for was served as a dancing girl in Tawatimsa heaven, just amusing the gods there. So he takes his Belawa wood flute. I think Belawa wood is, I think in Burmese it's called Vidi. It's like a marmelos or something like that. And apparently it has good resonance, good density and everything, makes good musical instruments. I think Mara's lute, or I think it's a weena in Pali, is also made of the same kind of wood. So he disappears, just as swiftly as a strong man might stretch forth his flexed arm or flex it again. Sakka, surrounded by the 33 gods and attended by Panchasika, vanished from the heaven of the 33 and appeared in Magadha on Mount Vaidiya. And it is kind of interesting just to see the evolution of the Indian pantheon of gods, that one of the 33 gods, obviously subservient to Indra or Sakka, is called Isana, who I'm pretty sure Isana is like a proto-Vishnu. That Vishnu is largely derived from this god who in Pali is called Isana. And he's mentioned in the Dajaga Sutta, which is one of the paritas or like protection chants that a lot of monks have to learn and recite over and over again. I had it memorized by heart a long time ago, but I haven't recited it in a very long time. But yeah, apparently Vishnu or Proto-Vishnu was one of the 33 gods up there. I don't think Shiva was. I don't think Shiva really rose to prominence until after the Buddhist time. He was still Rudra. I assume Rudra was up there because he's mentioned in the Rig Veda and everything, but he's not mentioned in the Jaga Sutta, who mentions let's see, Varuna and Pajapati and Isana as like the three gods just below Indra or Sakka. So that's kind of interesting if you're interested in the evolution of Hindu gods and goddesses too, I guess, suppose. So the gods are very luminous, which is mentioned in the third paragraph here, how the people were in fear because the gods come to the earth and it just lights up the entire area. So Sakka is very modest, doesn't want to offend the Buddha or distract him or anything, so he sends Panchasika at first to sing or play music from a distance. And why on earth he would play this? I mean, it's here. It talks. It's a song. It's verses extolling the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Arahants and love. But obviously, it's mainly extolling love, including breasts and thighs and so forth. So it really is. It's like the Song of Songs for Theravada Buddhists, because the Song of Songs also it's like erotic love poem that somehow got interpreted in as like religious symbolism. Like the love between Christ and the church, for the Christians anyway, or between God and the people of Israel or some such. So let's see, scroll down this love song here, and it's almost all he'll just toss a bone to the Buddhists, to Buddhism a little bit. Your radiant beauty is to me as dear as the Dhamma is to the Arahants, that kind of thing. But in a way, it's sort of an anti-Dhamma song because he's talking about how he's just enslaved to her. This kind of love is really frowned upon in strict Theravada Buddhist tradition, at least especially for monks. Like most of the stuff you find in the suttas, it's like warning against this kind of a stuff. And here he's like, into your bosom sweet I'd plunge, intoxicated by your beauteous form. O maiden fair of thighs, seize and hold me with your lovely eyes, take me in your arms, etc., etc. And then, of course, another little bone here. So you have waving tresses. See, my desire was slight at first, O maid of waving tresses, but it grew apace as grow the gifts that arahants receive. And that's just gifts that arahants receive grow because you get more back as good karma or merit than you gave somehow. That's what they say. It's that in itself can be a kind of religious propaganda where in the texts, generosity just generally is interpreted as generosity to monks and how you're going to go to heaven for offering stuff to monks. And I think a lot of wise guy monks really capitalize on that sort of thing and emphasize it in their Dhamma talks and so forth, especially in Asia, where the people are pretty much already conditioned to just want to support monks and spoil them rotten. It really is a struggle for like a strictly practicing monk in a devoutly Buddhist culture to stay austere when you've got people believing that they're going to go to heaven if they give you stuff and just spoil you rotten. That, I mean, they're just doing everything they can to just essentially wreck your practice. I remember once, this is a digression, once I was living under a tree in southern Burma, and there was this guy who would come to visit me, this Burmese man, relatively wealthy. And the conversation would just start off invariably with me sitting there saying, no, I don't need a new set of robes. No, I don't need a bowl. No, I don't need you to bake my old bowl. No, I don't need a chair. No, I don't need a mosquito net. No, I don't need this. No, I don't need that. Just on and on, just sort of like keeping him at bay from just giving me all this stuff that I didn't want. So let's see here. Let's just continue down this risque love song here. Oh, okay. So then the Buddha praises his Panchasika's skill at singing, which is kind of strange, because there is a sutta where the Buddha actually says that all entertainers are going to go to hell, but here maybe he's just being polite, doesn't want to offend the gods or something. So let's see. He's wanting the daughter of the king of the Gandhabas for his prize, and at the end he gets it as a reward for singing so good and softening up the Buddha for their meeting. So let's see. We get past. I mean, a lot of this mythological stuff. It's really not all that important to understand all of it. So I'm kind of skimming through the all this, like Panchasika talking about how he first met the Buddha and how he started desiring the beautiful Gandhava princess and so forth. So let's see. Yeah, then in the Indusala cave, when the gods came down to visit the Buddha, the rough passages in the cave became smooth, the narrow parts became wide, and it was all very miraculous and wonderful. And here the Buddha calls Sakka Kosya. And I think Kosya is a kind of owl. I'm pretty sure. But how Sakka came to be like associated with an owl, I'm not sure. There are several different words in Pali for owl that if you look in a dictionary, it'll just say owl, but I would guess that Pali was similar to the Burmese language where there is no word just for owl. It's just that each different kind of owl has its own completely distinct name. So you've got like the Zequet and the D-Dote and the Ngetso, and there's just all these different kinds of owls that each have their own name, but there is no word for owl. So I would assume that's why there's so many different words for owl in Pali, is that the lexicographers don't know what species of owl it is. They just think it's just owl. So let's see here. More mythology. Now it's Sakka talking to the Buddha. The Buddha does kind of chide Sakka a little bit by pointing out to him that the sound of his chariot wheels disturbed him from his meditation the first time he came to visit him. Let's see. And then Sakka is saying that one reason why he appreciates the Buddha so much, or one of his initial reasons anyway, was that when a Buddha arises in the world, the ranks of devas increase and the ranks of the asuras decrease. And This just goes back to very just prehistoric times in the Indo-European mythology, where you have the primordial war between the gods and the titans, or at least that was how it's described in like Greek mythology. But the titans of Greek mythology are essentially the same as the asuras of Indian mythology. You had this primordial war where the gods win, the asuras lose, and for the most part, or most of the asuras anyway, get imprisoned at the bottom of a mountain. I think in Greek it was Mount Olympus or Mount Parnassus, I can't remember which. And of course in India it's Mount Meru, which is the center of the world, the tallest mountain, like 10 million miles high. And then we got a little bit of sexism here, or maybe you can call it patriarchy, where you've got the story of a Sakyan girl who is apparently of the same clan as the Buddha in Kapilavatthu, which was the Buddha's hometown. Her name was Gopika, and she had great faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, and observed the precepts scrupulously. And she rejected the status of a woman and developed the thought of becoming a man. And this is common in like Asian Buddhist cultures where women are considered to be secondary to men. Now, they've found ancient votive tablets where women have gone to shrines and prayed, leaving this votive tablet behind, sort of to memorialize what they prayed for, saying that they wanted to be reborn in the next life as a man. I've met a few women in Burma, just within the past 20 years, who were likewise. It was like their goal was to get enough merit that they could be reborn in the next life as a man. So, as a result of her merit as a good Buddhist, after her death at the breaking up of the body, she went to a happy destination, being reborn in the heaven realm of the 33 gods, or the Tawatimsa heaven. And she became known as Gopika, which is like just the male version of Gopika. And then there's the story of the three monks who, having, they were ordained as monks, but they didn't really try. And so they got born in the relatively inferior, or after they died, they were reborn in the relatively inferior state of Gandhabas, which is lower than the gods of the 33. And they were essentially the servants of the gods. And so this new god Gopika, who was the woman, the Buddhist lady, in her previous existence, starts scolding them. And two of them are shamed enough that they start practicing Dhamma correctly. And they actually, they got enough merit that they attained to the realm of the retinue of Brahma. And that's, again, the whole approach to Brahma, the whole attitude towards Brahma in Theravada Buddhism is more propaganda, because Brahma, the earliest Upanishads had already been composed by the Buddhist time. Brahma was essentially the personification of ultimate reality. And the Buddhists probably knew this, but nevertheless put a whole slew of heaven realms higher than Brahma, just to show that Buddhists can get into these realms just completely beyond Brahma. Whereas the Hindus, or the proto-Hindus, the Brahmanists, the Vedic Brahmanists, or whatever you want to call them, they were pretty much just stuck at the retinue of Brahma, or the realm of Brahma. So then you've got the long verse by Gopika, who, part of the moral of the story is, if you're good, you're going to get good rewards. If you're not so good, you're going to get mediocre rewards. And that even gods are capable of making progress in Dhamma, which is kind of, they're not as likely of getting progress in Dhamma, again, according to Theravada Buddhism, because they're in paradise, and so they're not really urged on by suffering and squalor and just seeing suffering and squalor around them, that they're really motivated much to try to improve their lot in life. But it is still possible, and that's one of the messages you can glean from all this mythological stuff, that although it's better to be a human if you want to make progress in Dhamma, because if you're above the human level, like in heaven realms, things are so nice that you're really not spurred on to escape from samsara or to transcend samsara, because samsara is actually pretty nice. But if you're in the lower realms, you're either so tormented or so ignorant that you just don't have an opportunity to hear Dhamma or understand Dhamma or practice Dhamma. So being at the human level from the Buddhist point of view or the Theravada Buddhist point of view is considered to be ideal for making spiritual progress. So I'm still scrolling down here. The Wasawa is another name for Sakka apparently. And here a Buddha called the Sakyan sage. That's Shakyamuni. That's one of his better known epithets, especially among Mahayana Buddhists. But it's found. It's not very common, but it is found in Theravada Buddhism also. So keep scrolling down through this poetry. Okay, and then finally the Buddha tells Sakka, go ahead and ask your questions. And then you get to the second portion for recitation, the second Bahanawara. And Sakka starts asking questions that are very similar to those asked in the Kalahawiwada Sutta. And I'm going to put a graphic up on the screen where I can show you just how this first series of questions from Sakka and the answers, they really do closely resemble the Sakka or the Kalahawiwada Sutta, and they're both prototypes for the 12 Nidana theory of dependent co-arising. So in the standard stock description of dependent co-arising, which is just verbatim exactly the same almost everywhere you find it in the suttas, apparently in this sutta and in the Kalahawiwada Sutta, either they were already so well known that you couldn't just replace in the Kalahawiwada Sutta, it's all in verse, so you couldn't very well change it into the stock prose description of it. But it may be that the Sakkapañha Sutta, the commentators didn't even notice, or the early editors of the canon didn't even really notice how much it resembles dependent co-arising, like the stock formula. So in the stock formula, the origin of everything, the origin of the whole wheel of samsara, the whole cycle of birth and death and rebirth and suffering is ignorance or avidya. Whereas in the Kalahawiwada Sutta, it begins with perception or sanya. And in the Sakkapañha Sutta, it begins with papancha sanya sankha. And let's see, Walsh describes it. His translation of it is not very good, it seems to me. But I'll have to get to that later, since it's in reverse order. You have to kind of do it backwards in order to get the standard sequence, as in dependent co-arising. But in the Kalahawiwada Sutta, the first two links are sanya and papancha sankha, which are condensed together in the Sakkapañha Sutta into papancha sanya sankha. And papancha, he's got it as proliferation or something like that. And that is like the standard Polytext Society. It's one of the main translations of papancha. Papancha literally means something like extending outwards. But it's essentially like pluralizing the world. It's like distinguishing this from that. It's essentially how perception works. In order to perceive anything, first and foremost, you have to distinguish it from everything else in order to perceive that one thing there. You've got figure and ground. And the sankha literally means something like designation. So papancha sankha could be essentially the same as what, like in the Upanishads, Namarupa. It doesn't mean mind and matter. It means Nama literally means name. Rupa is form. So this papancha sankha would just be like rupa nama instead of nama rupa. It would just be transposed the other way, where papancha is distinguishing the world into parts, and then sankha is like identifying the parts. And that's essentially the way perception works. And perception is added in there, papancha sanya sankha. So it's like diversifying perception and designation. I think that's diversifying perception and designation. Something like that is how I usually render it when I have to translate the term into English. So in the stock formula, you've got ignorance, avidya leads to karma conditions or sankhara, which leads to consciousness, and then namarupa. Whereas in the Sakkapañha Sutta, it goes from papancha sanya sankha, which is the condensation of the first two steps in the Kalaha Vivada Sutta, and goes straight to just thinking. So first you've got perception, just diversifying the world into parts and like naming, identifying the parts. And then that leads to like some kind of thought. I'm having mental blocks sometimes. It's like discursive thought. Vitaka. Sometimes vitaka could be interpreted as like rationality or even logic. But here it just means like discursive thought. You know, your thoughts hooking up in sequence and, you know, making sentences and so forth. Then it skips over it skips over the six sense bases and contact and feeling and craving, and just goes straight to desire or inclination, chanda. So you start with like perceiving the world into just parts, discrete parts that causes you to think, and then from the thinking you start having preferences or, you know, inclinations like or well, not even liked and unliked, because that's the next stage, but you start having like inclinations and desires, preferences. And it's there's a few extra steps added in the Kalaha Vivada Sutta also. So it goes from namarupa, it goes from sanya to papancha sankha to namarupa to contact or stimulation, and then to pleasant and unpleasant, and then goes to desire or inclination or preference, which is chanda. So then it kind of becomes more similar to dependent co-arising in that the next stage is what is loved and what is unloved, or piya pm, which in the Kalaha Vivada version is just piya, and in the stock phrase or the stock formula, it's just upadana or uptake, clinging. So it's relatively similar. You can, if you compare the different versions, just the stock 12 Nidana theory with the Kalaha Vivada Sutta version and the Sakkapañha Sutta version, you can see that the stock Nidana theory is like a developed form of these earlier kinds of question and answer. This causes that, which causes this, which causes that, and so on and so on. So then, after Piya PM, or what is loved and unloved, then that causes jealousy and fear of loss. And Walsh here translates it as, jealousy and avarice. But I think a lot of translators don't really get what the term macharya really means, because it means essentially fear of loss. It's like in one sutta of the Attaka Vagga, it talks about how like grieving when somebody you love dies, that's also a kind of macharya. So it's not just being stingy and not wanting to get rid of your own stuff like a hoarder. It's just not wanting to lose something. You know, like the isa or the jealousy, that's like wanting to get something or just cling to what you've got maybe. But this macharya, it's just like being afraid of losing something. And then that leads to all the suffering. At the very end of all the different versions of Paticca Samuppada, you've got this list of ills that are caused by the whole sequence. And that inspires you, or is supposed to inspire you, to cut the sequence. And usually the sequence is cut at desire. So in the stock formula, you're supposed to cut this endless chain, this endless cycle between feeling and craving, or vedana and tanha. Whereas in this version, Sakkapañha Sutta, this proto-Paticca Samuppada, the chain is cut around thinking so that you won't get to the desire. So you're supposed to just cut the thing before you get to the desire, whether it's called dana in the stock formula or chanda in the sort of the proto versions, the prototypes. Either way, you're trying to not have desires. And by cutting your cravings, cutting your preferences, cutting your desires, then you're you're like essentially cutting the whole cycle of samsara and liberating yourself from the list of things like in this Sakkapañha Sutta version, it's enmity, violence, rivalry, and hostility. That's that would be my translation of the terms. It's Sawira, Sadanda, Sasapata, and Sabyapaja in Pali. So I mean that's interesting to me. I that's possibly the only real contribution I've made to Buddhist studies is just pointing out that dependent core rising did evolve. I mean, there are like proto dependent core risings that you can find in the suttas. And one of the earliest versions of that is here in the Sakkapañha Sutta, which, I mean, if you compare it with the stock 12 Nidana theory that just became this dogma later on, you can see that there are resemblances and that there's a very good chance that the 12 Nidana theory began with these kind of proto, question and answer, this causes that, which causes that, which causes that. And it just became like this cycle of samsara that it became like the center of Buddhist dogmatism, really. And it's not well understood at all. And I don't think that originally it was even considered by the Buddha to be dependent co-rising. I don't think the Buddha would have identified dependent co-rising or paticca with a list of causes and effects. That was a later development. That really it was more of a conditional thing where it's all simultaneous essentially. So I guess I belong to one of the heretical interpreters of dependent co-rising as being all simultaneous, like the famous English monk Jnanavira back in the 50s and 60s, who lived in Sri Lanka or Ceylon, I guess it was called back then, said that it says this arising that arises. It doesn't say this ceasing that arises. So he used that as a justification, one of several, for his belief that dependent co-rising was all simultaneous, that all the things in the list were simultaneous. And it's pretty obvious that they wouldn't be simultaneous. I mean, if you take it as a sequence, that this causes that, which causes that, it's like just thinking isn't exactly the same as the enmity, violence, rivalry, and hostility. There's a temporal sequence involved, but the original meaning of this arising that arises, this ceasing that ceases, that I really don't think that it was meant as like this linear sequence through time of cause and effect, that it was really more of a logical conditionality of existence, that samsara isn't ultimately real, it's just sort of conditionally or virtually real. But I'll continue on with my attempted commentary. So we get past this proto paticca, and there's still a little bit more philosophy, which is, I mean, it's pretty simplistic. It may be that it's aimed towards sort of a normie who isn't ordained, a god in this case, but still not an ordained monk. He's getting sort of the layperson's version. So let's see. The tendency to proliferation is what Walsh caused papancha sanyasanka, which is, yeah, I mean, he just completely ignored the perception part. So let's see. Scrolling down. And then I've got this part underlined because when I was a monk, I considered this part to be important. I made my notes in this electronic version of the text, which I downloaded from the internet for free. There are places where you can legally do that. Pretty sure it's legal. It's like Dhamma sites and so forth. It says, now of such happiness as is accompanied by thinking and pondering, vitaka vichara, it would be the Pali. And of that which is not so accompanied, the latter is the more excellent. The same applies to unhappiness and to equanimity. So if you can be happy without thinking, that's better than being happy with thinking, because the thinking is what gets you into trouble. That's one of the links towards misery in this version of proto-dependent co-arising. And it does make sense. I mean, if you can just be in the present moment, you don't have to be, you don't have to have this running commentary going in your mind all the time. You're better off without it if you can do without it. Sometimes it is necessary to think, but if it's not necessary, you're better off just not doing it. And that takes effort. Not thinking is not so easy. I mean, it might seem effortless because, you're just not doing something, but we are so programmed, and it's the power of our karma, so to speak, that causes one thought after another to arise, because karma is like the momentum of our mental states. So it's just pushing us forwards through life, and if we don't have anything in particular we consciously want to think about, then we're just going to get all this mental spam just because it's just going to be arising from the subconscious mind or whatever. And this part here where Sakka is asking, well, sir, what practice has that monk undertaken who has acquired the restraint required by the rules? And this is probably a stab in the dark by Maurice Walsh, because although I haven't clicked on this, yeah, Patimokkha. And then here I've got this note. The word probably doesn't mean rules here, but something more archaic. Yeah, the Patimokkha, probably originally it was every full moon day and every new moon day the monks would gather together and they would receive an exhortation like a Dhamma talk. And that was probably originally the Patimokkha. It was just sort of like I mean, there'd probably be a lot of do this, don't do that, but I don't think originally it was the meaning of Patimokkha was the recitation of 227 rules, which is what it has become relatively early on. It's been that way for a long time, where Patimokkha is just identified with this list of 227 rules, which isn't even all the rules. It's just for some reason it got singled out. These are the rules we're going to recite on the full moon day and the new moon day. But originally, it was sort of like just moral duty, something like that. I think that's how I've translated Patimokkha in my Acakawagga translation, as just moral duty, because it apparently did not mean a list of rules. In fact, the Acakawagga actually warns against adhering to lists of rules. But then again, the Acakawagga is pre-Theravadan. So I scroll down a little farther, and I'm sure I'm going to be skipping over some things that are noteworthy, but I'm sorry about that. I do the best I can. Let's see. So then Sakka understands in full the true meaning of what the Blessed Lord has outlined in brief, largely because the Buddha was giving like this detailed, this methodical description above, and all you have to do is just kind of fit it into the design or the system. So I mean, it wasn't any great brilliance on the part of Sakka there, but in Buddhist mythology, or Buddhist cosmology, I should say, I shouldn't be too derogatory. The gods, it seems like no matter how high up you go, they still have about an ordinary human intelligence. Every once in a while you can say they can see all these different worlds and so forth. So they do have mental powers that humans lack. But nevertheless, just intellectually, they really do not seem to be any more intelligent than human beings are. And I would guess that that's not so much the fact that there are no beings in this entire universe smarter than us. It's just that whoever is coming up with these narratives just has the limitation of their own intelligence. It's very difficult to realistically portray a character that's more intelligent than you. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger plays a super genius in some movie, and he just did not do a good job of it because he just obviously was not a super genius. You can't pretend, or you can't like imagine somebody more intelligent than you. You can't imagine intelligence greater than your own because your own intelligence is the limiting factor there. And I think that is one reason, probably the main reason, why no matter how high up you go on the scale in the realm of the whole system of the 31 planes of existence in Buddhism, that none of the beings there seem to be really all that much more intelligent than we are. Let's see. I hope I haven't skipped over the whole list of the different kinds of beings that are mentioned. Let's see. This part I've got underlined, so I'll just read it here. The world ruler of the gods. Oh, this is why. This is one question that is a pretty common question that is asked in the Atthakavagga also. So this also is reminiscent of the Atthakavagga, which is really ancient archaic Buddhism, pre-Theravadan Buddhism. So Sakka, king of gods, asks the Buddha, Sir, do all ascetics and Brahmins teach the same doctrine, practice the same discipline, want the same thing, and pursue the same goal? And then the Buddha says, no. And then Sakka says, why? And then the Buddha says, the world ruler of the gods is made up of many and various elements. Such being the case, beings adhere to one or other of these various things, and whatever they adhere to, they become powerfully addicted to and declare, this alone is the truth, everything else is false. So that's one reason why that is the official answer here to why different people believe different philosophies and follow different religions. Even in like the Iron Age Ganges Valley, where they are all pretty much in the same social culture, but nevertheless they still have these different beliefs. And it's kind of the same in the modern West. We have more or less the same social culture, but you've got people following all sorts of different belief systems. And they're just seizing upon this or that due to their own inclinations, due to their own previous conditioning, and then they just latch onto it and they just limit themselves to that and do not see the big picture. So let's see. More questions. Yeah, this is the obvious question. I think Sakka would have really known this when he asks, Sir, are all ascetics and Brahmins fully proficient, freed from bonds, perfect in the holy life? Have they perfectly reached the goal? I mean, why would he even have to ask if all ascetics and Brahmins are fully enlightened? So that's, I don't know, it's just kind of thrown in there for didactic reasons, I assume. And here, when it says, Sakka saying that passion is a disease, a boil, a dart, passion is, the word is raga, which usually is translated either as passion or as lust. And again, why on earth the Gandhava musician sang that very passionate, rather lust-oriented song at the beginning? How that got included in the sutta, I really don't know. So, let's see. I scroll down a little more. And keep scrolling. I'm trying to find that list of the different beings. But here's the part where the only other time Sakka was as happy as he was upon being enlightened or partially enlightened by the Buddha's discourse was right when the gods had defeated the Asuras in the primordial battle, which was known to the Indo-Europeans long before they ever got to India or Greece. Let's see. I just took a drink of sweet tea if you don't see me on the screen. Let's see. How do you... Okay. Oh yeah, and this is kind of an interesting part, and this kind of reflects back on what I was saying a little earlier, where the Buddha asks Sakka, what things do you call to mind when you admit to experiencing such satisfaction and happiness as he was experiencing? And the first thing that he reflects on is, quote, I who merely exist as a god exist have gained the chance by karma of another earthly life, which would be kind of counterintuitive, that you've got a god up in heaven rejoicing that he's going to be reborn as a human on earth again. But the reason why he's rejoicing is that he's rejoicing that he gets to be a monk. He gets to be a Buddhist monk in his next life if he wants to, and apparently he does, because you have to be human in order to be an ordained monk. You have to be a human man in order to be ordained as a monk. And so gods can't do it, and other beings like Nagas can't do it. According to the legend, the whole reason why that rule was established was because a Naga, which is a kind of shape-shifting giant cobra dragon, was it assumed human form and was ordained as a monk. But then, when they're unconscious, they assume their usual form. So at night, he fell asleep, and another monk walked by in the darkness and saw these huge scaly coils hanging out of the windows of this hut. And so he knew that it was a Naga. And then the Buddha told him, "Sorry, you have to be human. I mean, animals really can't become enlightened." Which, um, yeah, Eckhart Tolle would disagree with that, but we don't have to drag Eckhart Tolle into this discussion any more than I already just did. So then the next thing that Sakka rejoices is leaving this non-human realm of gods behind. Unerringly, I'll seek the womb I wish to find, which again, he's rejoicing that he gets to be reborn as a devout Buddhist human who can practice Dhamma and be ordained and so forth. And then the next thing he rejoices in is, my problem solved, I'll gladly live by Buddha's law, controlled and mindful and with clear awareness filled. So again, he's rejoicing that he's going to be a devout human practitioner of Dhamma in his next life, rather than living up in a paradise heaven realm with an army of celestial nymphs attending on his every whim, not to mention Gandhava dancing girls. And then the next thing is he rejoices in is, and should thereby enlightenment arise in me, as one who knows I'll dwell and there await my end. So, just there await my end. It's like once you become enlightened, then you just kind of patiently wait until it's time to die. I mean, that's a refrain that you'll find in the text when it's discussing, like, the arahant who has laid down the burden. He just, with equanimity and patience, he just keeps breathing until he stops. And then this is kind of strange, though. This may be unorthodox, because the fourth thing that Sakka rejoices in is that, quote, then when I leave the human world again, I'll be once more a god and one of highest rank. So apparently, there seems to be some confusion here, that after you become enlightened as a human, then you go up into a heaven realm, and there you have one more life, which is the way an anagami is. In the four stages of sainthood, you've got the arahant, who once he dies, he attains parinibbana, and he's out of samsara. He's just off the scale. What the non-returner, or the anagami, he's almost fully enlightened, but not quite. So when he dies, he goes up into this very high heaven realm, way above Brahma, the personification of ultimate reality for the Hindus, way above that, and he gets into the pure abodes where only Buddhist saints can attain, which seems to me to be a little more Buddhist propaganda, that the highest heaven realms, at least before you get to the formless realms, are it's only attainable to Buddhists. Only Buddhists get access. But here there seems to be some confusion, and this might be another indication of the archaic nature of this text, because originally I don't think there was a 4 stages of sainthood, like in really old Buddhism, that, for example, another set of archaic texts is the first suttas of an obscure group of texts called the Idivuttaka, which apparently is describing an anagami as fully enlightened, a non-returner as fully enlightened. And that's probably why they're called non-returners, is because it used to be a synonym for an arahant. Because once you die, you're just not coming back. You're out of samsara. But then, because the Indians had such a passion for systematizing, they eventually came up with this 4 stages of sainthood, and the anagami was 1 stage below the arahant. And here, I mean, it seems to be possibly even a transitional stage. I mean, I could just be misinterpreting this. It could be that it's just sort of ambiguous in the way it's described here, because he's already saying he was enlightened, and then he's saying that he's going to um, when I leave the human world again, I'll be once more a god and one of highest rank. And then the fifth thing that Sakka rejoices in is, more glorious than devas are the peerless gods among whom dwelling I shall make my final home. And that's where an anagami goes, up into the pure abodes among the peerless gods, where they have one last life. They're just very subtle. They're much more, the matter of which their bodies are composed is way more subtle than this coarse, crude matter that we're made of now. Oh, and I just noticed that my computer's about ready to... there we go. Good thing I got a warning. I'm down to 10% on the computer. I forgot to plug it in. But anyway, yeah, here he's saying that he's becoming enlightened, which the commentaries, I am sure, would say, well, he was enlightened enough to be an anagami. And then he goes up into this high heaven realm of the peerless gods, where he spends one last life and then just fades out into nirvana. So, let's see. That was the sixth thing that occurs to him, and at which he rejoiced. And then he, Sakka, King of Gods, recites some verses here, and which are just praising the Buddha, essentially, because he's so grateful, because he just became a Sotapanna. He just became a low-level Buddhist saint. And again, I don't think that the four stages of sainthood were like archaic original Buddhism. They got developed a little later, because Sotapanna also, it didn't necessarily mean like someone who had really had a glimpse of Nibbana, who was like a saint. I'm pretty sure that a Sotapanna, or a stream enterer, originally meant just someone who, like, from the Buddhist or the Christian point of view, would be born again. Someone who was just had their faith awakened and they become enthusiastically Buddhist, or they've just like seriously, wholeheartedly entered a spiritual life. If you want to call that a saint, maybe. But I don't think that the dogmatic statements with regard to, all Sotapannas are like this, and they no longer have these traits, and they can't tell lies anymore, and so forth. Yeah, I think that's like later developments in Buddhism. So, and then the whole thing ends with the Buddha granting the girl to Panchasika, and then he calls out three times homage to the Blessed One, the Arhat, the supremely enlightened Buddha, which is Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa in Pali. And then it says, and this is kind of interesting at the very end here, and while he had been speaking in this dialogue, the pure and spotless Dhamma I arose within Sakka, ruler of the gods, and he knew whatever things have an origin must come to cessation. And that is like the stock description of someone who, listening to the Buddha, becomes a Sotapanna or an Arya. So it's like that's like the defining insight that you have when you become an Arya, like a Sotapanna, is that anything, essentially, whatever has a beginning has an end, Neo. Whatever has a beginning has an end. That everything is impermanent, or at least everything that has a beginning is permanent. And that's essentially how it ends. Although the same thing happened to 80,000 devas as well. So that's another one of these, I guess you can call them Indian-style exaggerations. And in some texts, you've got literally billions of beings becoming enlightened simultaneously upon hearing a Buddha. And he could project his voice in a way that, all 80,000 or all, 3 billion or however many can hear him speaking clearly. So not only Sakka, but 80,000 devas, or gods, small g gods, all got this Dhamma I at the same time upon hearing this talk, which, again, it's kind of far-fetched to me. And before ending this, I would just say that, if you're going to be seriously studying Pali texts, you're invariably going to be coming across just these really mythological things, fire breathing dragons and Gandhabas and Nagas and so forth. Um, you're going to be coming across that sort of thing. You're going to be coming across just grandiose praise of the Buddha, sometimes coming out of the Buddha's own mouth, where he's just boasting, just extremely about how great he is and encouraging people to worship him and so forth. Or there's just all this religious propaganda stuff with the most important gods in the Indian pantheon just coming down and groveling before the Buddha, and all of his competitors, including Mahavira, the leader of the Jains and so forth, just being like just idiotic bunglers and charlatans. So, I mean, you have to be patient with that. And it's not necessarily discrediting Buddhism itself. It's certainly not discrediting the Buddha himself. But, I mean, it's even worse with Christianity, I think, where even Jesus of Nazareth's chief disciples, his 12 apostles, some of them apparently didn't get it even. It's like St. Peter, he's like swearing that he never met the Buddha or never met Jesus. He's just essentially lying to save his own ass on the night that Jesus gets arrested. He betrays Jesus, and he's like one of the chief disciples of this holy man, this supposedly this or this embodiment of God Almighty. And so with regard to the Buddha, he apparently was much more successful as a teacher. I mean, here you got just 80,000 beings all becoming saints just from this one speech. Excuse me. So, I mean, the Buddha was wise, but not all of his followers were as wise, obviously. Um, I mean, some of his followers became fully enlightened, so, I mean, supposedly, presumably, they had zero delusion, but still, even if you have zero delusion from a spiritual sense, in a spiritual sense, that doesn't mean that you're not going to be culture bound to some degree. You have to talk in human terms and speak in a way that the people around you will understand, and you're just going to adopt the cultural conditioning of your culture to some degree. You know, the Buddha did that. Yes, all other spiritual teachers have done that. You just have to adopt the spiritual or the cultural assumptions of your culture. And it doesn't mean that you're not enlightened, because enlightenment is just off the scale. Samsara is largely irrelevant to enlightenment. I mean, when you become enlightened, I mean, Nibbana is just not samsara, or it's just totally off the scale. It really has nothing to do with samsara. And so, just because somebody will go along with their culture doesn't mean that they're necessarily delusional, because the real wisdom is transcendental. It just goes beyond all this dream stuff. So, but still, I think a lot of the monks who were editing and compiling these texts, certainly not all of them were enlightened, because there is stuff that you find in the text that it's hard. I mean, it takes a lot of generosity to grant that it's an enlightened teaching. So anyway, I'll probably continue with this series. There is one sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya that I would like to discuss. I can maybe get back to the Sutta Nipata, which is more familiar to me only in the sense that I've translated a lot of the text myself, and I know a lot of the subtleties in the Pali terminology and so forth that I don't really notice if I'm just going with somebody else's translation. But I guess that's enough. We've been going for over an hour and a half now, so I'll just stop it here and be happy.